In the early 1860s, everyday life changed speed. Railways linked cities in hours, not days, and steam engines turned raw power into routine work. For many people, that progress felt like proof that almost anything might soon be possible. Jules Verne watched it closely. He treated new machines not as curiosities, but as signs that the world followed rules humans could learn and use. Verne wrote at a moment when science stopped sounding distant and started sounding practical. Newspapers carried reports of experiments, new materials, and daring engineering projects. Inventors failed in public and succeeded in public too. That rhythm mattered. Verne began shaping adventure stories that moved the way technology moved, step by step, with limits, costs, measurements, and consequences. He built suspense by asking what happened when ideas met physics. So his adventures relied less on magic and more on plans. He checked numbers. He borrowed real knowledge from his time and pushed it forward just far enough to feel reachable. That approach changed the kind of story he could tell. Big journeys no longer needed myths or monsters to feel thrilling. They needed engineering, logistics, and human decisions under pressure. In that world, even the most extreme destinations started to look like a technical problem. In 1865, Jules Verne published From the Earth to the Moon, and the idea did not arrive as a dream or a myth. It arrived as a plan. He treated a trip to the moon like a project that had to be built, paid for, and calculated. That changed the feeling of the whole question. Suddenly, reaching the moon sounded less like magic and more like a hard problem that could be solved. Verne grounded his story in the tools and knowledge people already had. He leaned on contemporary physics, and he filled pages with measurements, weights, distances, and timing. He asked what force had to be produced, what shape a vehicle needed, how much material it would take, and what mistakes could ruin everything. The point was clear. If the numbers did not work, the mission did not happen. That level of logistics created a new kind of suspense. The tension did not come from monsters or miracles. It came from preparation. Money had to be raised, engineering choices had to be justified, and the launch had to be treated like an operation with one chance to go right. Verne's moon voyage still stayed fictional, but its structure felt real enough to invite a dangerous thought. Maybe this was doable. As the book spread, something shifted. People stopped treating the moonshot as a clever stunt and started noticing how familiar the setup felt. Verne placed the launch in the American South, close to warm seas and open horizons, where eastward travel gained a boost from Earth's spin. It sounded like geography doing part of the work. A story about imagination had started to resemble planning. Then readers focused on the vehicle itself. Verne did not send a sprawling ship with sails or wings. He used a compact capsule built to hold a small crew, sealed up and shaped for survival, not comfort. It was a simple idea with big consequences. If the craft stayed small, every calculation, weight, supplies, speed, became easier to picture and easier to argue about. Most striking was how the trip ended. Verne's travellers did not glide back onto land like heroes returning to a parade. They came down to the ocean, where recovery became its own operation, built around finding a tiny object in a massive sea. That detail sounded practical, even modern. It pushed the story away from fantasy travel and towards something that looked like a real mission profile. In 1870, Jules Verne followed his first moonshot with a sequel, Around the Moon. The big change was simple but decisive. The story did not stop at launch. It stayed with the crew minute by minute as the flight unfolded. The moon became less of a distant prize and more of a destination reached through procedures, timing, and constant adjustment. The journey itself became the main event. Verne kept narrowing the focus onto what it actually meant to be sealed inside a capsule in space. He described the strain of confinement, the way daily routines had to be reinvented, and how small errors threatened to grow. Weightlessness stopped being a clever idea and turned into a practical problem with consequences. Food, rest, movement, even simple tasks demanded new rules. Survival depended on discipline, not wonder. And then there was navigation. Verne treated the trip like a moving calculation, where position and direction had to be checked and rechecked. The crew did not simply head toward the moon. They had to manage speed, angles, and timing as conditions changed. The story confronted the possibility of missing the target entirely. In that step-by-step approach, space travel looked less like fantasy and more like operations. By the late 1800s, Verne's Moonshot stopped acting like a one-off novel and started behaving like a shared reference point. Science magazines and lecture halls kept returning to the same question his story made easy to picture. If people could plan a journey on paper, could engineers build it for real? Writers treated his numbers, routes, and constraints as a serious template. Fiction did not replace science. It gave science a storyline. Then came the people who actually tried to push rockets beyond fireworks. A new generation of pioneers read Verne early and later cited him as a spark, sometimes even as a guide for how to think. They did not copy his canon, but they borrowed his mindset. Calculate first, then build. When these experimenters wrote articles and books for the public, Verne's moon voyage appeared again and again, presented as the clearest picture of what space travel could mean. That mattered because big projects needed more than equations. They needed an audience that understood the goal. Verne's story supplied a simple frame: a crew, a vehicle, a launch, a return. Popular science writers used that frame to explain new ideas like propulsion, weight, and vacuum without losing people. Step by step, the moon stopped sounding like pure fantasy and started sounding like a destination with requirements. A novel turned into a cultural blueprint. In the early 1900s, the moon stopped feeling like a distant backdrop and started looking like a problem that could be worked on. A few engineers treated rockets not as fireworks, but as machines. In Russia, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky laid out the math that showed how a rocket could keep accelerating in space. He turned the dream into equations. That changed everything. Then the experiments followed. In the United States, Robert Goddard built and launched early liquid-fueled rockets, proving that controlled thrust worked. In Germany, Hermann Oberth argued that spaceflight was physically possible and pushed for real designs. Step by step, rocketry became a discipline with tests, failures, and upgrades. It no longer depended on imagination. It depended on engineering. That shift quietly moved Jules Verne's moon mission into a new category. His story still had a cannon, not a rocket, and that mattered. But the bigger idea, people sealed in a capsule, launched by calculated force, guided by physics, now sounded discussable in technical terms. Scientists debated mass, speed, fuel, and survival. The question changed from could it be pictured to could it be built. After World War II, the question stopped being whether spaceflight was possible and started being who would get there first. The United States and the Soviet Union treated rockets as proof of strength, not just machines. Money, talent, and urgency poured in. What had once lived in drawings and arguments now became hardware on launch pads. A lunar trip no longer sounded like a literary stunt. It sounded like a national target. This competition pushed rocket design forward at a brutal pace. Bigger engines lifted heavier loads. Guidance systems improved because a rocket that wandered off course was not just a failure, it was a threat. Then came a new requirement: people. Sending a human meant building a capsule that could survive launch, vacuum, and re-entry. Heat shields, life support, and recovery planning turned abstract ideas into checklists. Step by step, the ingredients for a moon mission accumulated. Early milestones arrived quickly, and each one raised the stakes. Satellites proved a payload could reach orbit. Human flights proved a person could live through it. Longer missions tested endurance, control, and safe returns. With every success, the next goal had to be larger, louder, harder to ignore. A trip to the moon fit perfectly. It offered distance, danger, and drama, and it promised a clear winner. The superpowers began aiming for the same lunar prize Verne had once framed as achievable. In the 1960s, the moon stopped being a distant idea and became an announced deadline. NASA's Apollo program did not hint at it or treat it like a dream. It committed in public to landing people on the lunar surface and bringing them home. That single promise changed the tone of the entire effort. Every test flight, every failure, every redesign now pointed to one clear finish line. As Apollo gathered speed, a surprising comparison returned to the headlines. Reporters and engineers looked back to Jules Verne's century-old moon story and started lining up the similarities. A tightly planned mission, a small crew inside a compact capsule, careful calculations and step-by-step procedures instead of magic. The point was not that NASA copied a novel, it was that the novel sounded uncannily like the real checklist. Those comparisons spread because they helped people make sense of something brand new. Spaceflight felt overwhelming, but Verne's scenario offered a familiar frame. Ordinary humans using human-made machines, attempting a specific trip and expecting to return. For engineers, it worked like a cultural shorthand for disciplined planning. For journalists, it became a hook that made Apollo's complexity easier to tell. The past suddenly seemed to echo inside the present. In July 1969, the long build-up ended. Apollo 11 left Earth, reached the moon, and put human footsteps on its surface. Then it came home, alive. That single fact changed everything because it turned an old dream into a finished mission. Almost immediately, people reached backward for explanations. One name kept coming up: Jules Verne. Many claimed he had predicted it. The comparisons sounded irresistible. Verne had written about a small crew shut inside a compact craft aimed at the moon with careful calculations. He had imagined a journey that ended with the crew returning safely to Earth rather than vanishing into space. Apollo 11 now made those ideas feel less like fiction and more like a script that history followed. The timing made the connection feel inevitable. But the closer people looked, the more the differences mattered. Verne's travelers had been fired like a projectile, driven by an explosive launch, not lifted by a towering rocket that burned in stages. Apollo had separated its spacecraft into specialized parts and used controlled engine burns, not a single violent push. Still, the headline remained. He had seen the shape of it. Reality had made the resemblance impossible to ignore. In the years that followed, the big question changed. It no longer stayed on whether Jules Verne had predicted the moon landing. It turned into how he had come so close with the tools of his own time. Researchers treated him as two things at once: a visionary who pushed ideas forward, and a careful writer who pulled from the best 19th century science he could find. That mix mattered. It explained the accuracy without needing magic. When modern historians and science communicators broke down his moon story, they kept finding the same pattern. Verne borrowed real measurements, real arguments, and real engineering debates that already existed, then arranged them into a mission that felt complete. He guessed some outcomes well because he respected constraints: weight, speed, navigation, survival. He filled gaps with logic, not wishful thinking. The result looked like prophecy from a distance, but it worked like informed planning. So the parallels with Apollo ended up framed in a different light. They showed how imagination strengthened when it stayed tied to evidence, even evidence that later became outdated. Verne's launch method missed the mark, but his mission structure often landed near the truth. That contrast became the lesson people highlighted. He showed what careful thinking could do long before rockets made it real. And it proved how far the world had moved past steam.